Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Ball, and I'm the project coordinator at OCASI for the Allies and Refugee Integration Project. I want to welcome you to the webinar. I'm here with my co-presenter, Sally. Sally, want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. This is Sally Damashki from Refugee 613. We've been working with OCASI on this project.
As you can see, hopefully you can see the screen, as this will be a PowerPoint presentation, as well as Sally and I will be co-presenting the material. And you're all on mute at the moment, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions either verbally or in the chat box. So we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. I want to let you know that if you have any trouble or anything, again, if you're having trouble hearing us or anything technical, there's an option to raise your hand. Or you can chat in the chat box there, and we'll do our best to respond. Before we begin, just a few last practical things. Sally and I are aiming to keep this presentation short, about a half an hour presentation and then a half an hour for engagement around questions. We also want to thank some of you, because some of you may have been part of the research that went into the findings that we're about to talk about today. So we want to acknowledge the work and the effort that was really put in by the community to share their experiences with us, and we want to thank them for that. And as you can see, the topic of today's webinar is best practices for sponsor settlement collaboration. We'll be speaking about the research that we've just conducted on this topic, but we want to acknowledge that with all of the variety of experiences, we hope that you can see in the findings we're about to share some best practices that you maybe identify with, and there might be some that are very familiar or not familiar. But we were able to draw out some common themes to share with you to begin the conversation about how we can really bring together these two actors, sponsors and settlement workers, to better support privately sponsored refugees in Ontario. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Sally.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for joining. As Michelle mentioned, we're really thankful for everyone's interest and also support for making this environmental scan happen. So the project initially was started because there was an observation that settlement professionals and refugee sponsors are natural allies with the common goal of providing the best possible support for newly arrived refugees, but that these allies often struggle with communication and clarity, which can make collaboration a challenge. And so this is how the project was born. So the goal of Allies and Refugee Integration, ARI, is to develop innovative interventions and tools that build trust, increase proactive engagement with local service providers, and enable refugee sponsors and service providers to have a positive and effective experience working together to support the settlement of privately sponsored refugees. So this is a government-funded project by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and the work started in July 2018, and we're set to end in March 2021. And just to clarify, and we talk a lot about collaboration through this project, and I know it can be a definition that's a bit vague. So for the purpose of our project, the definition of collaboration is sponsors or sponsorship organizations and settlement organizations working together with the goal of supporting privately sponsored refugees, which we know can look very different depending on the community and the location. But to us, that's how we see that definition. And I will turn it over to Michelle to tell you more about the environmental scan. Michelle?
Yes, my apologies. I'd muted myself. So the ARI project is comprised of 3 phases. The first phase was an environmental scan where we wanted to get a sense of what's currently happening in the sector in terms of sponsor settlement collaboration. We'll be talking about the second 2 phases later, but this is basically to give us a foundation on which to understand the best practices and current practices that are happening. We did 4 months of research. We did a bunch of different activities involving a literature review, focus groups in 3 cities in Ottawa, Toronto, and Kitchener-Waterloo. We did interviews and 2 online surveys, the second of which was translated into Arabic, Tigrinya, and French for privately sponsored refugees. We had more than 360 people participate in the research. And as you can see here on the slide, the breakdown of people who participated by affiliation, we had around 135 sponsors or sponsor-related groups, around 40 privately sponsored refugees, around 100 settlement workers or organizations, and around 35 people involved in the SAW community, that's the sponsorship agreement holder community, and about 36 other. So we feel like it was a pretty good spread of participation. We were really blown away by how people wanted to have their voices heard, and this was a topic that was really of concern to people across all different sectors.
So what is currently happening in settlement sponsor collaboration? That's really the first question that we had, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to capture as much as possible of what was happening in Ontario. Some of the key things that we found was that there is some confusion around the roles and responsibilities of settlement workers and sponsors, and a need for increased mutual understanding. We saw that collaborations were happening and that sponsors and settlement workers were collaborating, but that, however, most of the collaborations were very sporadic and based on personal connections and not necessarily formalized. The other thing was that while some sponsored refugees and sponsors do access settlement services, we saw that a number of sponsored and sponsor refugees were unaware of the settlement services that were available to them, or they might have felt unwelcomed in settlement agencies in the past or currently as well. There's also a wide variance in experiences and needs of sponsors and sponsored refugees in accessing settlement services and the need for tailoring and equity in those services.
So the next research question we asked was, what are the benefits and the best practices when it comes to promoting settlement sponsor collaboration? We wanted to know what are examples of what's going well and what can we really aim towards if we're wanting to improve this collaboration. So some of the findings included that there is strong support, that collaboration is important, and that might be unsurprising, but even across different stakeholders, there was a mutual agreement that collaboration and increased collaboration is an important thing. We also learned about motivation. So what motivates sponsors and settlement workers to work together? And of course, unsurprisingly, the main motivation is to benefit privately sponsored refugees. So when we're talking about how do we promote collaboration, we need to keep coming back to that focus that we're doing this for the benefit of refugees. We also found that many people were discussing how we could use innovative approaches to settlement, and sponsors and settlement workers alike were interested in exploring different models of service provision, client-centered support, basically improving settlement programs so they can really serve the needs of privately sponsored refugees. We also heard about the importance of positive personal connections. People are motivated if they know one person and they're having, one settlement worker or one sponsor that they reach out to. They're motivated by that kind of interpersonal positive connection. And so concentrating on even that one person that you can reach out to can be important. And lastly, we discovered that one of the key times for intervention is at the beginning. So when you're building collaborations, you need information at the right time. And usually that means before the arrival of the privately sponsored refugee. It's a key time for sponsors and settlement workers to sit down and get to know one another. One of our participants in the survey said something that I thought was really spoke to this. They said, "Better together" sums it up, as we had the opportunity to leverage, help, and learn from each other, all in support of our refugee family.
So next, we were exploring what the main challenges of settlement sponsor collaboration. And the top challenges identified were lack of time and resources, as well as not understanding how sponsors and settlement can really work together. Some of the internal dynamics of sponsorship can prevent or delay sponsors as well from reaching out and collaborating with settlement service providers. For example, the fact that they're volunteers and that there's a variety of experiences and capacity in sponsorship groups. The other thing was that settlement service providers weren't given the tools and information they needed to reach out effectively and to target their services to local privately sponsored refugees' needs, and that it wasn't always a priority. And the last thing was that settlement service providers, there was some challenge in their ability to work with sponsors because it's limited because of the internal dynamics. So some of the internal dynamics include confidentiality concerns or funding restrictions. So some were also not really sure whether they were even allowed to engage with sponsors.
And to demonstrate some of these challenges that were identified by the stakeholders in the research, you can see on the screen here we have a table of some of the top challenges that were identified. Lack of understanding of each other's role topped the list, as well as lack of time, lack of resources, and that it's difficult to access each other when trying to collaborate. There were a few responses I thought that also illustrated these challenges from different perspectives. One of them is from a settlement worker who says, quote, "I think there is sometimes some confusion about how to work together when sponsors have written settlement plans, which indicate that they will take care of the settlement needs." So the settlement plan, for those who might be unfamiliar, is a form that all sponsors will fill out, indicating how they will support the privately sponsored refugee. Another quote is from a sponsorship trainer who said, "The difficulty to access each other comes from the way these services are funded. Settlement workers do not get any credit for meeting with sponsors, but a pre-arrival meeting would be very helpful." So these two quotes kind of speak to challenges in expectations. Are sponsors responsible for all settlement? And also challenges of access, how it is that practically sponsors and settlement workers are able to meet. Do they have the time and ability to do so?
So next, we were exploring how we could improve that collaboration and how to really move forward. So stakeholders identified two main types of interventions, focusing on connection and information. So the first one, in terms of connection, we felt this quote really represented what it meant to really connect to each other. And a former privately sponsored refugee said, "I think it would be more effective if the settlement support was on a regular basis. For example, the newcomer could visit every 1 to 2 months to monitor their progress. We found that in terms of connection, the quality, frequency, and the type of connections made between sponsors and settlement service providers really set the tone for all possible collaboration. Some examples of tools suggested that really target that connection included connecting sponsored refugees and sponsors directly to a caseworker at a settlement agency and having regular check-ins. So that's the example that we provided from in the quote. Also increased outreach by settlement service providers to sponsors with regular and in-person connection preferred. The government to be more involved in intentionally connecting sponsors and settlement service providers through information sharing, identifying one private specialist for privately sponsored refugee at a settlement agency as a contact for sponsors to go to. And there were also conversations about removing barriers to pre-arrival connections and encouraging sponsors to involve those settlement service providers in the settlement planning process. So before the refugees arrive, so that there's clarity in those roles prior to the arrival, so that when they arrive, it goes more smoothly.
So the second type of intervention that was suggested, and the second theme really is around information. We found that again and again, people were telling us that the quality and the accessibility of information really mattered. In general, we found that sponsors and sponsored refugees need better information on the services that are available to them, the settlement services. And we also found that settlement workers in general needed some better information and some more better tools and information on the private sponsorship of refugees program and how they can work with sponsors. The idea of training came up a lot. You can see here on the slide, one sponsor organization said in the research that training, it's so important, needs to be well organized, detailed, continuous, and mandatory. Other ideas that were proposed in our research about how to improve this relationship include creating an orientation guide on how each of the different stakeholders can work together, creating a centralized hub of information about the privately sponsored refugees program and settlement services that are available. Another idea was especially focused on ensuring that the information on roles and expectations of sponsors and settlement workers is clarified, and intervening, especially in the pre-arrival period, to get that information to the right people. Before we move on, I also wanted to acknowledge that a lot of these interventions that Sally and I have been suggesting, some of them might seem really resource intensive. You might be asking yourself, how do these interventions benefit everyone? Is it really worth it, to put in what could be a really big effort to bring together sponsors and settlement workers to work better together? And so I wanted to just take a quick moment to show how not only, of course, is there benefit to privately sponsored refugees in their settlement by bringing together these common allies to better support them, but it has other benefits, such as increasing the efficiencies of the settlement process, avoiding duplication of services. So sometimes it does happen that sponsors are taking on responsibilities that could be supported by settlement workers. Avoiding sponsorship breakdown. Sponsorship breakdown can be very difficult, very traumatic. And so if we can avoid that by better collaboration, it's better for everyone. And it can also help to avoid sponsor or settlement worker burnout. If each person knows their role and can work better together, we think that it could avoid burnout. and tensions between those two players. And lastly, utilizing volunteer power better. Sponsors bring a lot of volunteer power to welcoming and supporting refugees. So this is how, we can really harness that power through better teamwork.
So what's next for this project? So as we mentioned in the beginning, this was the end of phase 1. Phase 2 of the project is the co-design events, workshops, where we'll bringing together all of the different key players in this collaboration to work together on what it would look like to work better together and come up with ideas that could be implemented in the community. And then we will be implementing a few pilots, and then we'll also be evaluating them and seeing their success and how they could be replicated in different communities across Ontario. And even though this is Ontario focused, of course, we recognize some of these ideas would be beneficial for communities outside of Ontario. So the full report with all the findings from phase 1 from the environmental scan will be coming out shortly and will be posted on our website. We will be sending you an email with the information to make sure you know that it's been released. And the co-design workshops are coming up very soon. We will be opening registration this week, and so they will be happening in Ottawa, Toronto, and Kitchener-Waterloo. They're full day. There will be from 9:30 to 3:30. So we will also send information on timing. And so these co-design workshops are really meant to bring people together and dig in deeper into some of the recommended tools and for collaboration that were identified in the first phase of the project. The co-design workshop will be very interactive. It's about really people sitting together and talking through what it would look like to implement specific ideas in their communities and what they think would be really the best way to do that. So we do need your participation. We want people from those communities to be represented, and we will be sending an invitation as well that you can share in your network. And just to give you an idea, the pilots will be running starting fall 2019 until 2020. And we will be selecting the pilots with our advisory group, which consists of people who represent all these communities that are involved in the project, and we will be selecting them with them based on specific criteria and testing them out. And yeah, and we have included the link as well where you can stay tuned for any new information that comes up.
Thank you. So that concludes the formal portion of our webinar. I would like to suggest that if anyone has